From the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa, welcome to a live recording of Switchyard, a podcast for people hungry for eye-opening essays, moving fiction, soul-stirring poetry, and honest, thought-provoking conversation. I'm Ted Genoways, editor of Switchyard magazine and your host. Each month, I'm joined by a lineup of literary all-stars as we think through and hash out our world's difficult and fascinating challenges. Tonight, we're in the big room of Leon Russell's historic church studio in Tulsa. We're excited to have such a great crowd for this second episode in our live audience podcast series. The program will include a musical introduction by Casii Stephan, poems by Pulitzer Prize winner Carl Phillips, a reading of his essay from the new food issue of Switchyard magazine, and then a brief conversation between Carl and me before Casii plays us out. First up tonight, Casii Stephan is a remarkable talent. NPR has compared her vocal delivery to Fiona Apple and her songwriting style to Carole King. That's obviously high praise, but Casii, in my opinion, has her own distinct voice and style. She has a new single that will be released on March 5th. What I admire is her ability to bring the confusing fragments of contemporary life into a classic songwriting setting. Her forthcoming EP is called Relationship Status. It's a song cycle that takes listeners on the emotional journey from one social media status to another. Likewise, the song she will perform tonight, called These Hard Days, is about working through a very contemporary problem, the challenge of COVID lockdown. But is also about the big themes of loneliness and how we weather through difficult times. That will be a theme for the evening, and I'll return to that. For now, please join me in welcoming Casii Stephan.
These hard days, when the good days seem only in the rear view, and there's pressure mounting to smile as if the skies are still blue. Oh, these hard days, and these hard days, when anthills feel like burdens that we can't escape, and our heads are filled with fears that we won't ever escape. Oh, these hard days. But can you lift your head? 'Cause it's not over yet. Can you raise your voice? 'Cause there's still breath inside these lungs. Yeah, though these days may be long and hard, there's still our days. And these hard days, when your bones are weighed down by every thought you've had, and emotions keep you paralyzed inside your bed. Oh, these hard days, and these hard days, when fighting for your life is like breathing in the smoke. You think that you'll survive, but you're unsure of the scars left behind. Oh, these hard days. But can you lift your hands? 'Cause help is on the way, and it's okay to scream at silence. 'Cause you'll never be the same. Yeah, though these days may be long and hard, there's still our days. So here the other, working to love each other. And here we breathe, ooh, ready for forgiveness, ready to believe that we can lift our heads, 'cause it's not over yet. We can raise our voice, 'cause there's still breath inside these lungs. Yeah, though these days may be long and hard, there's still our days. Ooh, and we can lift our hands, 'cause help is on the way. And it's okay to scream at silence, 'cause you'll never be the same. Yeah, though these days may be long and hard, there's still our days. Yeah, though these days may be long and hard, there's still our days. Yeah, though these days may be long and hard, there's still our days.
Tonight's featured guest is Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Carl Phillips. Carl is the author of 16 books of poetry, which have earned him the reputation as one of America's greatest living poets. He's also an outstanding critic. Don't let him tell you otherwise. His last book was a finalist for the 2023 Pegasus Award in Poetry Criticism. He's also a translator whose rendering of Sophocles from the original ancient Greek was published by Oxford University Press. He's also done tremendous work as a steward to the poetic community. He's a chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. He's been the judge of the Yale Series of Younger Poets for more than a decade. He's taught poetry writing at Washington University in St. Louis for more than 30 years. Carl is a pretty impressive guy. Yet his reputation rests on his ability to shed many of the trappings of daily life in favor of a hushed and meditative voice that can often feel like an intimate whisper, or even somehow, improbably, like our own innermost thoughts given voice on the page. He is a poet of mood and shifting sensibility, exploring themes of restlessness and unease, even anxiety, that seem to tap directly into the deepest parts of the modern mind. Carl himself has described his work simply as an ongoing quest. I should also confess, I consider Carl a dear, dear friend. He was a mentor to me when I was a young writer. He welcomed me as a colleague when we served together on judging committees for literary prizes, and we have shared more than a few glasses of wine at the Breadloaf Writers' Conference from his designated third-floor perch at Maple Lodge with a view of my regular room in the distance. Still, it was a bit of a surprise to me when I saw Carl at Breadloaf this summer, and he expressed not just an interest, but an eagerness to be part of the Switchyard special food issue. Carl isn't thought of necessarily as a food writer. He's not thought of as someone whose work focuses on the particulars of daily life in quite that way. But he told me he had something he wanted to work through, which is his usual way. He wanted to write a bit about the joy he had found during COVID lockdown and being in the kitchen, and the sense of community and connection he had found by sharing his cooking routine on Instagram. Many people who knew him only as a poet saw a new side of him, a private side full of joy and hope in the midst of uncertainty and fear. And yet, the real pleasure of cooking is one of sharing family and home, creating community and a place around a literal table, something that no social media platform could provide. Tonight, Carl will begin by reading a few shorter poems just so you get to know him, his voice as a poet. Then he will read his remarkable essay from Switchyard entitled The Fog Lifted. And be sure, among other things, to listen for the cocktail recipe contained within. That's the cocktail shared on our social media channels for our podcast listeners. Thanks so much to everyone, all of you, And please join me in welcoming Carl Phillips.
Thanks, Ted, and everyone at Switchyard, and thank you, Marianne, Andre, and everyone involved at Tulsa University in bringing this all about. And Magic City Books, Casey for the wonderful music. I would rather sing than do an essay, but I can't really sing as well as I think I can. So I'm told. And I think Ted summed it up. I'm just going to read some poems, 3, like he said, and we'll read this essay. Okay, this is called Gold Leaf. To lift, without ever asking what animal exactly it once belonged to, the socketed helmet that what's left of the skull equals up to your face. To hold it there, mask-like, to look through it until looking through means looking back through the skull into the self that is partly the animal you've always wanted to be, that, depending, fear has prevented or rescued you from becoming, to know utterly what you'll never be, to understand in doing so what you are, and say no to it, not to who you are, to say no to despair. Okay, here's a super short poem that has a little rhyme. As my students say, do you ever rhyme? Hardly ever. This is called Overheard Under a Dark Enchantment. Compassion first, we were told. And if that won't work, compassion's shadow, pity, to smooth what's rough. We find just holding the victim's hand lately has been exactly enough. And I'll finish this part with this poem, Fixed Shadow, Moving Water. One friend tells me everything's political. Another says nothing is. We just make it political. By we, he means human beings, I assume. What's political to a fox curled in sleep, or a pond, or a sycamore in winter with no leaves left to stop the snow falling through it? I have loved you for less time than I have loved some others, but none more deeply than you. No one more absolutely, which, as if inevitably, amounts to a hierarchy of sorts, doesn't it? Value, then the power that comes with it. Soon enough, the distribution of power. Who gets to do the distributing? But if we make of tenderness a countervailing force, the two of us, if we can make from tenderness a revolution.
These hard days, when the good days seem only in the rear view, and there's pressure mounting to smile as if the skies are still blue. Oh, these hard days.
All right, so I'm going to go to this essay. Thanks. It's funny because the person I asked earlier, can I have a music stand? And they seem to be explaining why it wasn't going to work out. And now I see why it might be a problem. But that's okay. I stand by it. Okay, here's this essay that I want to say Ted made me write, but we have a disagreement about how it came about. Apparently, I begged to write it. Okay, it's called The Fog Lifted. It was early spring still. The dogwood brandished those pollen-laden buds that precede a flowering. History, what survives or doesn't. How the healthiest huddled, as much at least as was possible, more closely together, to give the sick more room. I was nowhere I'd ever been before. Nothing mattered, or seemed to. I practiced standing as still as I could, for as long as I could. On March 21st, 2020, about a week into lockdown, when COVID and the fear of it had rendered the city voiceless, no human voices, just the routine interruption of ambulances, of helicopters lifting from and descending upon the roofs of the nearby hospitals, I decided to make a batch of scones. And for reasons I can't entirely recall, except that I often decide to do things just to do them. I turned my phone cam on and started recording different stages of the process, but in 1-minute segments, because that's as long as the phone allows. Here I am, revealing the ingredients, while Sade plays in the background. Here I am, pointing with my dough-caked hands at the rolled-out discs to be cut into rough triangles. Here I am, removing the first batch of finished scones, and here I'm explaining what we do while waiting for the next batch of scones to bake. Dance to Madonna. Make up lyrics like, "Quarantine is not captivity. Nope, no it ain't," while panning to my dog as he stares at me, bewildered yet unsurprised, I think, as I do a spin inside the kitchen's entryway. I posted a total of 6 videos on Instagram, marking the stages of my scone journey. Each video got more likes than the previous one, and the likes kept coming. For days, I figured people must have nothing else to do during lockdown. That must explain the popularity. Eventually, it occurred to me that although it had seemed a random whim, my deciding to video my baking, there were truer reasons behind that decision, reasons that likely lay as well behind my viewers' engagement. I was afraid. And though I've always, in general, preferred to be alone most of the day, I felt strangely lonely, unexpectedly close to what felt like despair, with nothing specific to be despairing about. Yes, there was a mysterious disease in the world, more mysterious, it seemed, than the ones that have always been here and remain mysterious. And I was living, like everyone else, in quarantine. But I was lucky to live in a house, a sizable one, with plenty of room for my partner and my dog in lockdown, with a nice backyard. I could work easily from home. I loved cooking. We could eat. Why despair? And everywhere the smaller birds again noising, filling steadily all the cracks between spells of rain. Only connect, goes the famous epigraph to E.M. Forster's Howard's End, which in the context of the novel seems to mean 2 things: that we should try to connect our feelings and our thoughts, heart and mind, within ourselves, and that we should cross various differences, but social class especially in that novel, to make contact with our fellow human beings. I hadn't thought that a superficial exchange with a server in a restaurant, for example, counted as a connection of this kind. But I now realize that even that brief exchange is a form of acknowledgement. You are here. I recognize that. We are here together, 2 bodies with feelings. If we fail and triumph at different times and to different degrees, it's still disappointment. It's still the rush of victory. To that extent, though strangers, we know more than a little about each other. Is this not intimacy? A form of it? A form of intimacy that, because of my having embraced a life of relative solitude, I think I embraced it, though maybe I'd just gotten used to it the way habit can just become what's true. I hadn't known I relied on daily until it wasn't there. As if song could still mean something useful. During lockdown, social media showed many people displaying the bread they'd made, the vegetables they'd grown in pots from scraps. The point of my scone video wasn't to say, here, I made these, but to say, here's how I make them. Let's make them together, even if we're in different towns, or countries even. Thanks to technology, we can be anywhere and not be alone. Thanks to my millennial partner, I learned that it's possible to do live, uninterrupted video recordings on Instagram, instead of the brief segments I was videoing, and then posting after the fact. And thus my cooking show, which I never did give a name to, but which came to be known as The Cooking Show, was born. Thank you, millennial partner. From the start, the theme was how to make do with what we have on hand, and ideally how to make something that might give pleasure without fancy ingredients. For most people, the ordinary act of getting groceries had become fraught. If the stores admitted customers, where I was living they weren't allowed to, there was a genuine panic about catching COVID in those pre-vaccine days. Plus, the food supplies were limited and therefore unreliable. Having groceries delivered was another option, but not as unaffordable for many. So I began with simple recipes, using ingredients people were more likely to have on hand. Recipes for things like a carrot salad, for which there's no precise recipe, just this. 1, peel some carrots and grate them into a bowl. Easy so far. 2, see what else you have and chop it and add it. Some stray cherry tomatoes, the end of a cucumber, the few olives that have been sitting in their jar in the refrigerator door for months. 3, drizzle some olive oil over it all and squeeze some lemon juice. No lemon? Use an orange. No orange? Try some vinegar. No vinegar? Just the olive oil. 4, stir it up. Add the spices if you like, or just pepper. Enjoy. That's my version of a recipe. While making the food, I did what I always do when I'm alone in the kitchen, not realizing that this is the last thing people expected of me. I danced a lot. I'd sing to playlists I made. Dancing and singing always make me happy. Plus, they're a way to make tedious tasks, like peeling and grating carrots, seem like part of the entertainment, the fun. From the start, though, viewers wrote to me saying that they'd had no idea I was so fun, so funny, so able to laugh at myself and be ridiculous, and to make human mistakes like squeezing the lemon into my eyes by accident, or putting 4 cups of flour instead of 2 into the pizza dough and wondering why the dough wouldn't work. Viewers of the show, which briefly ran 5 days a week until, between time and limited supplies, I had to change it to once weekly, were equally surprised by how I'd end each episode. I'd belt out a song, Mama Cass's version of Dream a Little Dream of Me, for example, but each time a different song, and then bring the phone close to my face, look into it, and say, and that's it for today. Remember, I love you all. Then turn the camera off.
But can you lift your head? 'Cause it's not over yet. Can you raise your voice? 'Cause there's still breath inside these lungs. Yeah, though these days may be long and hard, there's still our days.
Or a kind of pleasure that, like forgiveness, came easily, and summer storm that forgiveness is, passed quickly through. Why should it be surprising that I have a sense of humor, that I enjoy dancing, and that I might care about others and make a point of saying so? To speak to the fun and dancing part, I think immediately of a review I received many years ago for my book, The Rest of Love. I knew I was in for it when I read the opening paragraph, stating that a reader would never find words like boxer shorts or Schenectady in my poems, because my poems were devoid of humor. How boxer shorts or Schenectady are by definition funny is another question. The review concluded by saying that I'd be incapable of ordering tacos without turning it into a metaphysical experience. So the reviewer had made the 2 worst mistakes in book reviewing. He'd refused to read the book on its own terms. Not every book intends to be funny, so looking for humor is pointless for that kind of a book. And he'd made an assumption about who I am in daily life based on a poem, when poems come from a very small and particular part of my life, the part that seeks to make meaning from language and turn it into art. Remembering that review is helpful, though, in clarifying the surprise of those watching my cooking show. Most of those viewers knew me only from my poems, and my poems are decidedly serious. My attempts to pin down, if only briefly, the various conundrums of sex, desire, fidelity, intimacy, how to be human and animal at once, how to square hope and ambition with the fact of mortality. Stuff like that. Much more than fiction, I find, poems seem to make people feel they know the poet, likely because of the vulnerability that poetry always in some form requires. We win the reader's trust by letting our guard down, starting with, in my own case, the predominance of the pronoun I. We can call it the speaker, all we want, but it still sounds like the poet is speaking, because it usually is. Meanwhile, I might be writing a poem from a hotel room in Schenectady while wearing boxers. But those parts are the context for the writing. They're not the poem itself, not for me. I go to poetry when I need to work out a problem. And yes, it's usually a metaphysical one. But most weekends, I go to Mexican brunch with my partner. I order tacos, and there's nothing metaphysical about any of it. Just tacos and some laughs over margaritas. Art and life overlap here and there, inevitably, but I turn to each as a distraction and sometime respite from the other. I can't live superficially all the time, nor can I brood forever. And the undersong that has been our own voice, saying, no, I'm not afraid. It's true enough, though, that for all my writing from and about intimacy, I'm not quick to make friends or trust others in real life. Growing up biracial, and though it took me a while to know it, queer, too, explains a lot of that. Not being let into the group means learning to make a space for oneself outside of it, and generally alone. And over time it feels, because it is, like home, all the harder to leave, therefore. Harder, too, to invite others in. It's as if estrangement were the mind's way of rescuing us from further instances of the rejection that drove us into solitude in the first place. We no longer require others, or we don't believe we do. The friendships I do have are, for the most part, long distance, as if the distance made friendship and trust more possible. If they don't come close, they can't hurt me, would seem to be the logic here. Though, of course, we can betray a person from afar quite easily. But at the very least, the day-to-day work of maintaining a local friendship, meeting for coffee, offering an actual shoulder to cry on, all of that goes away. Yes, I am aware that I've described the maintenance of friendship as work. What we cannot do, what we cannot undo, all the work we must do. This morning, I tried to think of poems where I've made specific reference to intimacy, and I came across this one where I speak of, quote, the mind protecting itself by shutting down an intimacy that most likely won't be returned. Why expect it? As if that were the mind's chief purpose, to resist a fall, though falling's what the body does best, is quick to rise for. And 13 years later, there's this excerpt. All that falling upon the field of intimacy, then getting up just to fall back down again, you crying right there in front of him as you hadn't before, ever, and have not done since. I'm intrigued that in both instances, I've linked intimacy and falling in one case as a thing to be avoided, resisted, and in the other case as the means of arriving at intimacy, the arrival coinciding with a moment of extreme vulnerability, crying in front of another person, something that, as if shameful, the you has not done since, has possibly, likely made a point of not doing since. But falling's what the body does best, is quick to rise for. If this is the case, the idea seems to be that at the very least it's an instinct to fall, and the being quick to rise in order to fall suggests it may be more than an instinct, a desire to fall, even knowing the vulnerability involved, the possible regret and/or shame later at having shown that vulnerability, and even knowing the work that meaningful intimacy entails.
When fighting for your life is like breathing in the smoke, you think that you'll survive, but you're unsure of the scars left behind. Oh, these hard days.
The gray of doves in shadow. The cooking show involved a kind of intimacy that lay halfway between the kind of intimacy I have with my distant friends and the kind of intimacy that exists more immediately because daily and locally with my partner, given our living together. The camera made all the difference. I don't see my distant friends. We all agreed long ago to forego FaceTime. More to the point, they don't see me. Turning the cam on for the show was a new kind of vulnerability for me, a one-sided one. Viewers entered, as it were, my kitchen. They watched me while I had to imagine who they might be, what they were doing, exercising, walking a dog, curled up in bed somewhere in Europe. I wonder, though, if the one-sidedness helped. I couldn't see the reactions. I didn't fear rejection or being seen as silly. Although I knew people were watching, since the phone would indicate when people had joined the session, and occasionally some would respond with a comment or question or emoji, I was too caught up in what I was doing to feel self-conscious about outside attention. I'd entered the same space I exist inside of when writing a poem, when my awareness of audience falls entirely away. There's a wild freedom to that space, a freedom to be reckless, vulnerable, to take risks, because who's there to see it if I should fail? Who's to say which way's the right way, and where lies mistake? Each time I looked into the cam, I saw myself, being variously, sometimes clumsily, often laughably myself. But the excitement that I felt when doing the show didn't derive from what might sound like narcissism. The idea of seeing myself on camera, with the advantage of that, was that it distracted me from the idea of audience. At the same time, though, people started writing to me, and I became aware of a growing audience, not just for the live show, but for the recorded episodes I'd post after each show, for those who couldn't make the live version. Some wanted to tell me how much they learned at a very practical level, for a large part of what I teach was technique, the vigilance required for toasting walnuts, how to preserve lemons, how to roll out a crust. But the majority spoke of the show as solace, as respite from the uncertainty that governed those early days of pandemic, uncertainty, and a feeling as well of living in exile. My show reminded them that sheer fun still existed, that a communion is necessary, and that food, the preparing and sharing of it, remains one of the oldest forms of communion. Here, I made this for you. Eat and be again restored. It occurs to me now that doing the cooking show was really just a version of what I've devoted myself to for almost 40 years, teaching, which I've tried to do more humanely, more humanly than I myself experienced from most of my teachers when I was growing up, when to be taught felt more adversarial than invitational, less about enjoying a subject than about proving mastery of it. In all my teaching, but especially when I taught high school, I felt my subject matter was the least important issue. Yes, I wanted my high school students to learn Latin, as I want my college students to learn about poetry and the writing of it. But I've most wanted to offer, in the course of teaching, one possible model for how to live as a human being, among others, which includes how to fail, how to weather disappointment, how to laugh at mistakes, how to care for others and for oneself, how to live fully in mind and in body. Maybe most important, how to make a point of finding and pausing for joy daily, in whatever small form. One form of joy on the cooking show was dancing. Another was singing. The show inadvertently became a lesson on adapting, though, when I was told by Instagram that I couldn't just play Whitney Houston songs on a show without getting, and presumably paying for, permission. I should have realized this, of course. Thus began my singing a cappella, which doesn't count, apparently, as copyright violation, or it's just harder to keep track of. Another pivot to make up for the loss of recorded music was that I began reading poems, to be clear, not my own. What, I'd ask, might we do while waiting for the oven to preheat, or while stirring our stew? Why, here's a poem by Ellen Bryant Voigt. Let me read it to you. Reading, of course, like the making and sharing of food, is another of the oldest forms of intimacy and communion. If only the leaves would stop moving, if I could read and know, for once, what? At some point during 2020, I learned that my publisher had agreed to publish my next book of poems, and I decided to share the news on the cooking show and to celebrate by making up a cocktail based entirely on what I had at hand. I named it after the book itself. This recipe makes 2 drinks for yourself and a friend, or just yourself. Nothing wrong with being your own friend. Then the war. 4 ounces of vodka, 2 ounces of triple sec, 2 ounces of grapefruit juice, 2 ounces of cucumber juice. There's the wild card. A squirt or 2 of honey, an ounce of lime or lemon juice. Shake the ingredients in a shaker over ice, then serve up. That is, no ice. I raised my glass, signed off as usual, turned the camera off. I stepped out to my back porch, sat down, and didn't feel alone at all as I raised my glass again, this time to an audience of 2 dogwood trees, an oak, and a stand of bamboo, some of it dead, some still green and thriving. I made a fist with my left hand. With my right, I covered it, the sign for peace where I come from, though it also can mean a swan sleeping. Who am I? The hero says to himself, looking past his reflection on the lake's surface down to where the darker greens give way at last to darkness. Deep in the early days of a pandemic, I started a cooking show from a small camera phone propped in a window of a small, barely lit galley kitchen. I shared cooking tips, poems, songs, dance moves, and quite a few opinions. Then it was early summer, then summer, and the pandemic was still real, but we were told we must move on. That is, leave our homes, return to the workplace, proceed as normal, so they kept putting it, as they still do. But nothing will ever again be the same, nor should it be. Like most animals, we humans are designed to change as the world that we live inside of also changes. Each afternoon, as I step into my kitchen to make the evening's dinner, I miss the cooking show that went on there. I miss the community and the communion that technology and a lot of time on my hands made briefly possible. But the fact of missing it all reminds me of what I'm most grateful for, the one change in myself that means the most to me. The cooking show taught me that being myself, my many selves, was enough, that I'm still guarded, but don't always have to be, that I can say and mean it to a bunch of strangers, and just as important, to myself, I love you. A light wind stirs the surface. The reflection trembles without breaking apart. Thank you.
Ooh, we can lift our hands, 'cause help is on the way, and it's okay to scream at silence, 'cause you'll never be the same. Yeah, though these days may be long and hard, there's still our days.
So, Carl, I wanted to start by asking about this question of humor. I mean, it's confronted directly.
I think it's humorous that we're here pretending that we're having a conversation. I mean, we are having one, but yeah.
Well, you ask, why should it seem funny or unexpected to your readers that you're fun, that you're funny, that you dance, you sing, all the things.
Delightful.
Yes, you are delightful.
Yes.
That's so true. Carl really is delightful. It's true. But it is true that your poems are, by your own admission, they're quite serious. They're meditative. They're often in a kind of hushed focus. And it is quite different from what you do than in prose. And I wonder if you could talk about like what you see as kind of intrinsic in those forms that allows you to do different kinds of things.
Sure. Well, for me, poetry, it's about wrestling through unanswerable questions. And that's what I go to poetry for. It's why I enjoy reading it by other people. So the unanswerable questions are usually pretty serious ones, like what is life about? Why do we die? How will I die? Things like that. And to me, a poem is a place to delve into that and past the superficial understandings that we have. Like, we just have Valentine's Day. So I know you're supposed to get Valentine's cards and say things like that you love people or whatever. But no one gives a real Valentine's card that would say something like, well, I love you, but no guarantees. And we might evolve in different directions at different times. And these things are also true. But that's not what you want, a Valentine's card. So for me, I go to poetry for that. But in an essay, which I actually don't like writing essays because...
Why did you press so hard to write this one if you...
I was under the drug of bread loaf, summer ecstasy or something. I don't know. Ecstasy, happiness, joy, I mean, not the drug. Because once I'm writing an essay, I think, oh, I do have some things to say, and I think I can say them and all of that. So anyway, that's all to say that essays seem as if they're a place to get differently lost, because in poems, I want to get lost and surprise myself with where I end up and what I stumble across. But in an essay, you've got, maybe it's just more terrain, and it's also maybe not, for me, it's personal, but I'm not usually writing memoiristic essays. That would be a different kind of thing to write. I don't know. I guess I just think that there's a weird intensity to lyric poetry that is different from the openness and expansiveness that lyrics provide.
The thing that I see in common in your poems and in prose is I get the sense in reading that there's a preserved sense that every sentence is its own setting out. Mm-hmm. And that you don't even necessarily know where the sentence is leading yourself as it begins. And I understand that some of that is artifice and that some of that is a created sense of the mind at work. But it's a really distinctive quality of what you're doing. And in some of the poems that you read to begin, the sentences trail into silence, that the sentence itself doesn't even quite resolve.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about the whole idea, though, of the artifice of it. Because I know people think that, but it's not true. It's truly just how I think. So people always think, oh, you must work hard in these sentences, like to try to make them weird and twisty and strange. But I don't. It's just how they are. And I don't know. I've always thought that way. Or like people will say, oh, it's because you studied Greek and Latin, so it must be the grammar is similar. Well, I don't know if that's true.
You don't think that's the influence?
No. If there's any influence, it's reading novels by Henry James and translations of Proust where long meandering sentences that I did always think, wow, how long can you go with a sentence? But I wasn't thinking, oh, I want to craft that. I want to do that. But maybe that is where I learned the idea of the sentence as itself an adventure. And also I'm interested in modulation. So having a really long sentence and then a sentence that's just 3 words long, that sort of abrupt halt to the journey.
So one of the amazing and peculiar coincidences of this issue.
Yes.
There's a short story which I encourage all of you to read called Greta by Micaiah Bay Galt.
Yes.
I also am a big fan of the way that her sentences move and have a similar kind of unspooling quality to them, a sense of discovery as the sentence moves. I asked her about that in editing and her influences, and she said, well, I got that from Carl Phillips. Mm-hmm. And I thought she meant from your poetry, but as it turns out, she was a student of yours when she was in high school.
Surprise. I know. I'm so proud of her. I've had so many wonderful students in the past, but she turned out to be a writer. It's cool.
But she attributes that sentence structure to Latin and to your sense of the Latin syntax.
Maybe she's right. I mean, she's one of the only people I know who still is around who remembers me from those days. So maybe she knows me better than I thought. She was only like 15, whatever you are in high school. I guess you up to 18. I don't know. So
in theory, yes.
No, there's something very strange, stirring, and disorienting about having someone who was your high school student be an adult person with children of her own. I imagine it's what it's like to be a parent, I suppose. And I don't understand it. It's very odd. And she looks exactly the same, which is also odd.
As do you, I'm sure.
No, I mean, many things are different about me. I had hair. She still has hair.
So I want to ask you briefly about some of the poems in Then the War. First of all, you noted that this is not a typical new and selected poems. That
the book? Mm-hmm.
Yes, that the new poems are, in fact, a collection and intended as a collection of poems
on
its own.
Mm-hmm. start
you want to
talking.
say anything about that?
Yeah, and I happen to really dislike, no offense to anyone in the audience, I really dislike new and selected books of poems because it always seems, usually it's that there are 12 new poems, 15 new poems, and then here's all this other stuff I wrote for decades. And I feel like, well, why didn't you wait till you had enough poems for a real book? It seems a bit, and plus it's hard to know whether to buy the new and selected, because if you're a real fan of someone's work, you already have those books that the things were selected from. So you're going to pay all this money for a fat book, but only 12 of the poems are new. Read them in the store. Or at this point, I actually would just take a picture with my phone in the bookstore and do that.
The people from Magic City Books are here. Don't encourage people to do that.
But, while you're there, you might buy some other books.
Sure.
So there's that. So I wrote this book called Then the War, and it was all by itself, and that was all set to be published. And then the sidebar is that I had always wanted to have a publisher in England. But when I would ask my publisher here, how does that happen? He would say, you wait patiently until someone asks you. So I thought, okay, I guess no one wants me. And then my publisher here said, Carcanet in England wants to do a book of yours, but they don't want to do Then the War. They want to start with a selected poems and introduce you to this UK audience. And I first thought that would be fine. But then the American publisher said, and maybe we should do that and hold off on Then the War and do a new and selected, or just a selected. And I didn't want to do that. So I thought, well, why don't we combine them? But thus began a big argument about how the book would be called, because he wanted it to be called Then the War, New and Selected Poems. And I wanted Then the War and Selected Poems. Then with the font, I wanted it to be that Then the War was big, but Selected Poems was little. But also I wanted a colon, and I lost. There's no colon after the war. I wanted to be Then the War and then and Selected. But anyway, that's all to say. It's really two distinct books, but they got smashed together so that I could have the British publisher. Sometimes how books come out is not how you planned it. It's a marketing thing.
But it does seem to me it's an interesting, perhaps coincidence, but it's, to me, the poems at the front, the new poems, are poems of transition, poems of perhaps seeking a new stage.
Yeah, but there's 35 of them as opposed to 12.
Yes, that's
so
true.
It's a full book.
Absolutely. No one's questioning the fullness
I'm just saying
of the
because
collection.
I feel like I only write full books. None of this smattering of...
That's true.
Or like you get really old and people say, do you have any childhood scribbles? And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that just to stay in the game.
Well, it strikes me in this way, that these poems are seeking out kind of a new stage. It seems like a right moment for a kind of backward glance at the same time. And you're arriving at this moment of transition. You alluded to the fact that you've taught at Washington University for many, many years, but are retiring and returning to the earlier landscape of your youth, to Cape Cod. And yet, as you've said, what I think is always interesting about your poems is that they represent a kind of psychological biography.
I like that.
A change of mind, a movement of mind, but often stripped of what we would think of as the basic biographical facts.
Yeah, I talk to my students a lot about psychological and emotional narrative, because we think of narrative poems as a story. There's a beginning, middle, and end to those poems. But there are also other kinds of narratives, and the psychological one really appeals to me, interests me, to see how you've changed your way of being in the world and thinking over time. And that's not as simple as, now I live here and now I moved there, here's where I broke up with somebody or whatever. Those are biographical details. But it's also, to me, biographical how your mind is changing and as you move into different landscapes, but including not just physical, but psychological landscapes. So as I say to my students about that, it's like, if just to write about having felt sad and for a moment left sadness and felt something like joy is a narrative trajectory, because it's moving from one place to another. So in some ways, I like to think that's how all poets' books, if you brought them all together, are. You're looking at what they wrote in their 20s and their 30s. And that may not be what they were actually physically doing in the world, but it's how they were thinking at that time and what their obsessions were, what haunted them.
There's a poem in the collection that I think of as a kind of ars poetica.
Oh?
Yes.
What is it?
A statement of your philosophy and trajectory, maybe an artistic statement of purpose of some sort. The poem ends, I'm a song changing. I'm a light rain falling through a vast darkness toward a different darkness. It could be anything. The earth. It could be the sea.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, you wrote that. But it's I'm a song changing. That you see yourself as the project, as the song, but an always changing song.
Yeah. Again, I guess I feel like, aren't we all a song changing? And I don't know what I in particular meant at the time I wrote that poem, so I don't remember exactly when I wrote it. But first of all, we were just talking about COVID and lockdown. That was a whole big change of how we live. But, then you have different losses. I actually think of poems, for me, I usually think of them as advanced bulletins from the interior. So to me, they often aren't a record of what has happened, but they foresee what it's going to be. And when I think of that poem, it seems to me that it was looking forward to just different losses that happen in the last couple of years and I think, oh, that often happens with me. I'll look at a poem and later think, I think that's what I was anticipating, maybe. But at the same time, I think we are all songs changing and having our slower moments and our wilder, fluttering moments. And I don't know, I'm not sure how far to push that simile. But I like that idea of that being an Ars Poetica.
Well, I do too. I think it is one. So I want to end in an unusual or surprising place for you.
Will I be surprised?
Perhaps.
In an okay way?
When we were here at the Historic Church Studio earlier today, looking around a bit at this space and some of the collections here, we talked a little bit about the Leon Russell song, A Song for You. And you talked a bit about your response to that song and a kind of connection to that song.
Yeah.
I wonder if you would talk a little bit about it and about the connection that you were describing with that. And I should say, as a kind of preface for people who may not know the song, that it is a song of backward looking and someone who is a writer of songs. A wonderful admission. I've sung a lot of songs. I've made some bad rhymes, a kind of self-critique of that body of work, but also seeing the song as a vehicle for a legacy and a way of continuing to connect with someone beyond the bounds of a relationship.
Yes. Well, it's a song that's very meaningful to me for the reasons you say. It does mean those things. And it seems to me, although I think, yes, the person in the song is apparently a songwriter or a singer or performer. They talk about they've performed in front of many people, but we're alone now and I'm singing this song to you. And first of all, mostly I don't believe in regret because I don't believe in things that are inefficient. And it doesn't change anything to regret anything in some ways. Though I'm beginning to think that's not true, because if you regret them, that means you might spend time rethinking what you might have done to regret. But anyway, it seems to me that it's hard to get very far in a life, like age-wise, without having messed up a lot. Inadvertently, if you're lucky, but sometimes on purpose and because it seemed the right thing at the time. So there is a weird taking stock that song offers. Also, what I like about it is it's not blaming anyone. It's saying, well, okay, but here we are now. And even if the person they're addressing isn't physically there, like we're alone now, but I'm singing this to you wherever you may be. You may not even be here in the room. But there's a way in which it still counts that we were here. And it still matters that we tried. And part of the stumbling and the hit or miss aspect, especially of relating with other people, is just part of being human. So I don't know, it's not exactly a song of forgiveness, but it's a song of at least trying to be at peace with the messiness. So yeah, it does mean a lot to me.
Carl, thank you so much for your words and your time tonight.
Thank you.
Everyone, Carl Phillips.
Thanks. Thank you.
And now, if you'll please join me in welcoming Casii Stephan back to the piano here in the big room at the church studio. She's going to play us out with the song we were just discussing, Leon Russell's A Song for You.
I've been so many places, in my life and time. Sung a lot of songs, I've made some bad rhymes, I've acted out my life in stages with 10,000 people watching. But we're alone now and I'm singing this song to you. I know your image of me is what I hope to be. I've treated you unkindly, darling, can't you see? There's no more important to me, darling, can't you please see through me? 'Cause we're alone now and I'm singing this song to you. You told me precious secrets of the truth, withholding nothing. You came out in front when I was hiding. But now I'm so much better, and if my words don't come together, listen to the melody, 'cause my love's in there hiding. I love you in a place where there's no space and time. I love you for my life, you are a friend of mine. When my life is over, remember when we were together. We were alone and I was singing this song to you. Where there's no space and time. I love you for my life, you are a friend of mine. And when my life is over, remember when we were together. We were alone and I was singing this song to you. Song to you. We were alone and I was singing this song. Yes, I was singing this song to you.
Thanks for listening to Switchyard. I'm your host, Ted Genoways. If you liked this episode and you want to support our podcast, please share it with your friends, post about it on social media, and leave a rating and review. Switchyard is a production of the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa. We made this episode with executive producer Marianne Andre and Charles Lipper and Cassie at Volubility Podcasting. Special thanks to TU President Brad Carson and the Church Studio.